Hey everybody, so we're going to go ahead and start the chapter on activism. We're going to talk a little bit about, we're going to start out talking about really those fundamental things that we talked about with your education from the very get-go, right? That promise of a feminist education is a reminder essentially why we're here. It's to learn about the social construction of gender and gender binary, to talk about the intersection of gender with other systems of inequality. So to talk about all of our isms and our obias. So our racism, our sexism, our homophobia, our transphobia, our ableism, all of the things, right? To talk about the ways in which women are not homogenous, that we have different life experiences depending on all of our interactions with our systems of inequality. And so our perspectives and what we think or feel like needs changes, or the inequalities that we face, are different depending on all of our identity statuses. To promote a familiarity with the status of marginalized peoples and work to make a world that improves the lives of those marginalized and the conditions of their lives. And again, that's just, again, talking about the ways in which we could promote activism against these systems of inequality. We wanted you to be able to apply your life to the concepts you're learning, including your privileges and your oppressions, and to really talk through the ways in which you as a human are part of this conversation, are part of this lived reality, are part of your social world. And most importantly, we wanted to think critically. We wanted to learn how to think critically. We wanted to process thinking critically, and we wanted to think about our social world in a critical way. Feminist education, if done really the way we're intending to or trying to do that, it's a space of inclusion. It's a space that talks about being socially just. It tries to be socially just within the classroom, but also tries to promote the amount of change needed for a socially just world. It's accessible. It's non-hierarchical. It's anti-racist, anti-sexist, and anti-colonialist. And that's not saying that it's just we're going to talk about these things, but it's actively trying to destructure the syllabus to talk about, have a more diverse set of authors, set of perspectives, bring and share light to the multiple perspectives within the classroom. It's really trying to deconstruct the ways in which we make education white colonialist perspectives on history, on the social world, on status, right? It's promoting love, respect, and civility. It's progressive and transformative, right? We're trying to promote and transform the world around us. We're trying to make the social world less, have less oppression, have less inequality. And to do that means that we have to do that from a very progressive and transformative lens. We also need to look at science as a human project and look for the biases within ourselves as scientists and in the social world as scientists, right? And that includes trying to look at who's writing it, what they're benefiting from, what they're funded, what their purpose is, who they're trying to serve. Even as we think critically, we're thinking critically about our own authorship. We're thinking critically about our own biases when we do projects. We're thinking critically about who we might be excluding, who we might not intending to be, what choices we're making on filling out a survey, what choices we're making on creating characters, what music we're not including in our repertoire, right? It's all of the things that we're looking for and thinking through as we look for and look at the science and about the social world and more broadly. And we also want to understand and know that knowledge is political. And while knowledge is a space in which we want to be apolitical and we want to be truth-based, we understand that truth is based on the perspective and biases of the human making the truth, right? I can say for me that it is a truth that I need doorways that can access. In order for me to be able to go into a building, the doorways have to be able to access my chair or specifically my walker. However, that may not be the truth from a lot of you in this classroom, right? It would be looking at particular ways in which you're like, yeah, I can go into pretty much any building I want to. That's a truth of mine. But that truth is very different depending on the ways we look at the world and the ways that we think about the world and the way we experience it. So we're going to talk a little bit about activism. I'm going to take a moment for some current events and some spaces in which activism is really at the forefront. We can talk about the environmental movement, in which we see just a plethora of young people of color, of young adults in general, young women really making space and taking up space and being proud of taking up space in the fight for our world, in the fight for our ecosystems, in the fight for the injustices that come out of economic destruction, or ecological destruction. We can also look at the amount of activism surrounding immigration policies, surrounding our inability to, our country's unwillingness to make immigration more viable and more accessible, to make it a more safe process, to make it a more inclusive process, to make it a more family-oriented process. We can talk about essentially the ways in which that particular structure, especially when we're talking about refugees, sets up unobtainable goals if you don't speak the language and you know nothing about the culture. Now, if you know English and you're coming over as a refugee, you're probably going to be okay. But without documentation and the ability to find a job, speak the language, learn the education you need to learn, even to get your GED or what have you, you lack the ability to really have or create a dynamic where possible visas can continue will be very limited. We also could talk about just activism against violence. We can talk about the Me Too movement. We can talk about Black Lives Matter. We can talk about really the ways in which the LGBTQ movement, the specifically trans rights movement, is really making and taking up space in very different ways than in prior generations. Everywhere you look at this juncture, you are seeing very, very large movements of people and successful long-term movements. And that's, I don't think, something we have really seen in a very large, capable way since the 1960s, 70s, where you had the civil rights movement, you had the feminist movement, and you had the gay liberation movement at the same time. And I think we're seeing that this another pivotal point in history where we're going to really see what we can progress and what we can change. And I think that that's something to really keep an eye out on and get involved with. Activism is important because most social change happens when the thoughts, minds, and hearts of the people in the society change, and they change their economic structures to adhere to their own moral standards as they change. And I think that as we really talk about activism and the ways that the strategies for being successful in that, we need to also think about what are those issues that are most important to us and figure out a way in which we can get involved in making those issues bigger. We can make those issues brighter, and make sure we're doing that in an inclusive and intersectional way. And so that kind of brings us to the strategies. Your book talks about multi-issue and multi-strategic, and essentially multi-issue meaning that while you can have those particular core points of whatever movement you're doing. So like say Black Lives Matters is talking about police violence. They're also talking about missing and murdering Indigenous women. They're also talking about trans rights. They're also talking about LGBTQ plus rights, right? They're also talking about the justice system overall. They're talking about the court structure. They're talking about lack of accountability, right? There's multitudes of issues that they're doing. On top of that, there's also a lot of collaboration with other movements, and specifically feminist movements, to make space and to take up space and to create wow, I just lost the word for that. Not collaborations. I will figure out the word in a minute. But really making your voices louder, bigger, stronger. And you don't do that by being one person that's the loudest in the room. You do that by making sure that your movement is also helping in being there for the other movements that are working to create and fight inequality. Feminist issues that are currently and remain still part of goals within the movements include economic equality, affordable higher education and trade schools, affordable and accessible childcare, affordable health care, trans and international responses. You're going to talk about reproductive rights. You're going to talk about violence against women. There's all of the things and all the inequalities that we've been talking about throughout the course of the semester are things that have movements tied to them. And they're going to talk about also being multi-strategic, which is just talking about the fact that you want different perspectives and you want those all to be able to coalesce and communicate what it is that you're needing. And that's going to include international and transnational collaborations. That's going to include intersectional approaches, which is talking about multiple identities and where those things intersect, and really getting the perspective of all of those when we're talking about things about what women need. We need intersection ideas on those women with disabilities, trans women, women of color, queer women, all of these other kind of intersections with women that will create different kinds of inequalities and really having a more broad conversation. We're going to talk about reformist approaches, which is really just this idea that you're essentially taking the legislation or policies that are there and then really reforming them to reflect whatever change you're looking for. You can also have transformative approaches, which is essentially just the idea of transforming the entire structure of something. So especially when you're talking about policy, like let's start anew, right? Like let's figure out a way in which we can create a democracy that not only needs to systemically represent me, but also needs to systemically represent equity for people like me, right? And then you have radical approaches, which are just essentially, let's break it all down. Let's break the hierarchical structures that are all interconnected, and let's figure out ways to radically change those in ways that would make history, right? And that's including the framework of not just adding a sprinkle in diversity, but really, especially not just a sprinkle in leadership, but you're talking like making everybody's voice known and figuring out a way to make equitable all of the issues that we have on the table. And the modern protest, they listed some examples of the things that it needs. And I think that this is important because as you move forward in your academic career, you're going to find yourself capable or hearing about or being around activism movements, because you see a lot of that on college campuses and a lot of that within the framework of the age group that you currently occupy, most of you currently occupy. And it's focus on a target audience, come up with intention grabbing ideas, organize your supporters, schedule your protests for the highest and greatest impact. And that includes location and also time of day. Advertise your intentions, be media friendly. So have those conversations with the media, because they are a big outlet for how to get your problems and your solutions out into the world. And then follow up, keep following up. And any feminist movement should be founded in the ideas of love, human dignity, and community. So a modern example of that is really Black Lives Matter. So the 3 women that started Black Lives Matter did so not just because they cared about their Black community, but they cared about their female community, but they cared about their queer communities, but they cared about people. And it stemmed out of this idea that lives mattered, and specifically marginalized lives that were consistently being taken, that those were not done so in ways that were okay. And that police brutality and someone taking someone else's life, that those lives were people, that they mattered no matter what their lives looked like prior to that moment. That being killed and being someone who experiences violence at the hands of others and at the hands of discrimination is not something that is part of a world that we want, right? It does not promote the ideas of love, human dignity, and community. And so this movement is surrounded around this idea that you can take a bunch of people and get them together and say, this is enough. We've had enough. Our lives matter. Our brothers matter. Our sisters matter. Our trans lives that are being taken also matter. Our ability to create an economic future that does not land us in these situations matter. Our ability to live in the world matter. And that I shouldn't have to teach my kids, and this is coming from a Black mother, should not have to teach their kids how to avoid or how to interact with cops so as to not get killed. That should not be part of the conversation that they're having. And I think that Black Lives Matter gave a good, and if you want to, or if any of you are interested, I will have a document that links you to how to get involved in any of these groups, including the nearest chapters and what have you, but it also lists on there the Black Lives Matter homepage, and allows you to really search through their document of core goals and of core values. And I think that when you look at that comparatively to what the media tries to represent them as, it is something to be reminded of why having your own voice and being able to consistently put out your own statements and being media friendly is so valuable and so important. And I'm going to get off that soapbox. Moving right along, we're going to talk about feminist visions. What kind of future do we want? How do we want to envision the future? What are the trends that are currently going to impact our possible futures? And they talk about aging populations, changing in demographics of specifically this country, but worldwide too. Talking about a climate crisis and the ecological problems that were going to arise. We're talking about an increased wealth gap, which again is going to be part of that lecture that I do on trickle-down economics and again the wealth gap. And then there's really 7 implications, and they talked about setting feminist priorities and keeping them, a balance between personal freedom and identity with public and collective responsibility. So really, and we saw a lot of this when we were talking about conversations surrounding public health and COVID, right? We need to be able to balance our message of personal identity and our message of being community representative and part of a community. And that really means that we need to not just think about ourselves, that we have to think outside of ourselves and really look at the world as a community and look specifically at our own community, marginalized communities, and try to figure out ways to help embolden them. Understanding that corporate capitalism does not work for everyone and is not in our planet's interests. Capitalism specifically feeds off of groups of laborers that lack the ability to rise up or lack the ability to become stable enough to demand better. And it also is resource hoarding and resource extraction at a level at which the ecological processes cannot maintain. And it's something that we need to continue having conversations about. Understanding the limits of technology, its sustainability, and its accessibility. So really having a conversation about how technology impacts communication, but also limits communications to specific groups depending on your economic stability, right? Economics becomes, again, mixed in with that. It's advocating for a sustainable physical environment. Again, coming back to capitalism, coming back to technology and the amount of resources extraction we are doing as humans. Respecting human dignity, celebrating difference and diversity, and acknowledging that equity, not equality, that equity and equality are not the same thing. Because some of our marginalized populations aren't going to need to just be equal. They're going to need to be lifted up to be able to make up for the historic roots and the problematic and or hurdles, social hurdles and lack of opportunities that have been given for an extended period of time that has led to major economic disadvantage. And then again, lastly, make time for humor, for play, for celebration. Make sure that you give space for yourself as you're fighting for social justice, to breathe in the good parts, the little victories, and to breathe out all of the stuff that you still have left. There's always going to be more. And I think that so often we get stuck in this framework of activism where if we're not going after it 24/7 all the time, which is not sustainable, then we're not getting there. We're not doing the most. And we have to have lives too. We have to have humanness too. We have to have coping time. We have to have decompression time. So find your you time, especially while you're in school and learning all of this, because it's hard and it's a lot. And find time to celebrate the little victories and celebrate yourself. And so we're going to get into these last three little things, and we're going to power through it, and then we're going to be done. Hurt was really talking about feminist men. I gave you a list over here on the side of Black feminist thought and places to start. So people to read. And if you want particular readings from these, your book has some of those from different authors that are in here, but also there are many book lists I could give you. I did not want to overwhelm you with all the different texts that these individuals have that are amazing. If you want to start, there's several different authors that are fictional authors in here. You've got social scientists in here. You've got poetry in here. You have a range of ways in which you can embody and or experience Black feminist thought. So in this particular lecture, or in this particular reading, he really talks about internalized feelings of dominance and entitlement to women that men are taught as they're growing up, especially Black men. He talks about how violence is not always physical. And when he talked about his father, he talked about the mental violence and emotional violence that really was happening within that relationship. He talked about the MVP program, which was really male athletes taking up a stance that violence against women is not okay, and that their project to end violence against women amongst athletes, especially professional athletes, and to really have being able to lift their voices in a positive way when it came to violence against women. He also talks about the intersection of race. I love this quote that he says. Somebody asked him, he said, how does African-American men's violence against African-American women uplift the African-American community? And this is something that within marginalized status, and you could replace this with queer partnerships, you could replace this with disability status, you can replace this with other marginalized racial or ethnic groups. And I think it's still sets, right? How is this lifting up your community? And if it's not, why is that the pathway you're choosing? And I like how he talks about how he was realizing the differences between the perspectives of the women in his life and himself when in one of the seminars they asked the men and women separately what things they have to do to protect themselves from being raped or sexually assaulted, and the women could go on for a long period of time and fill up an entire blackboard of all of the things, and essentially the men didn't really have anything to say. And that again is promoting this difference of perspective, this difference of life experiences. And then again, Black female feminists, just real quick shout out, Black female feminists have been doing the work, and typically in a more intersectional and inclusive and systemic way, for an extended period of time. They have always been doing the work. They are and have always been innovators because the world has and still does require them to be. So it's important, especially as a white feminist myself, to read these voices, to hear these voices, to have conversations with Black feminists, because I cannot be an ally and I cannot be an active feminist without listening to the other perspectives of women in other marginalized statuses. And this is a good place to start because, again, especially from the 70s, 80s on, but even going back to Ida B. Wells, even going back, to that era and before, you're still going to have Black feminist thought that is out there. Sometimes you have to search a little harder for it, which is sad, but it's in there. And within this list, I gave you queer feminist, I gave you trans feminist, I gave you all sorts of different eras, all sorts of different kind of literature. So really have at it. If you have specific topics you want to discuss and you want particular kinds of recommendations, I have no problem giving you some or giving you links to some ideas on where to start. Building coalitions, that's the word I was looking for. See, I knew it would come to me eventually. I just had to read it. What makes it possible for the trans women in Spain today to be a part of the feminist movement with little resistance was the overarching questions of their research project. They did an oral and a lit review, an oral project to really have conversations with people and really get out how this went about. They hypothesized that queer presence in the movement, there was queer presence in the movement from the start, and that was the reason for this little resistance. But they also understood that there was multiple reasons and that there was more nuance to that. They realized that the collaborations and the alignment with trans movement came from really 1993 on, and the commitment to openness and debates and their conventions really allowed space to have these conversations. Political objectives met personal relationships, and so really the people that had a more hard time with really having this coalitions really had less personal relationships, and those who had personal relationships with trans women in their community did a better job about making or creating those bridges between the two movements. It was not always a smooth journey, but it's a reminder that feminist movements are not homogenous and that there are places in which those coalitions were happening earlier, they were happening more consistently, and they're being done in a more inclusive way. And I intentionally leave you with this reading, which is one of my favorites of the entire semester, called Most Women You Know Are Angry. And it talks about how anger is coded as masculine, how the feminine anger is taboo. It talks about how period jokes are an example of the ways in which females are made to feel little or controlled within a particular, even within the particular structure of humor. The patriarchy is so scared of women's anger that eventually we learn to fear it too. And I think that there's some point to that, right? They also talk about how race complicates anger and how specific marginalized populations, when they show anger, are stereotyped in specific ways. I love the part where she talks about strength is measured in women in silence. And the more strong woman you are, the more silent you are. And I think that that's being broken down to an extent, but for a lot of folks, it's not. And that's still the messaging, especially in your disabled communities. It's also this message that being broken is okay for females, but being angry is not. But anger is a feeling and hatred is an action, and there's a distinct difference between those two. And as a society, I love this quote, as a society, we fail to distinguish between emotions and actions, but it's what we do, not what we feel, that delineates the difference between right and wrong. Sorry for the typo. They talk about anger is unattractive and that it will lessen your ability to find partnerships. But I love that she pushes back on that and says, listen, if you can explicit your anger and it grows on you and you can learn to channel it and use it, then you're going to find people in your life that advocate with you, that become allies in that. And you're going to find more meaningful relationships because you can show the parts of you that are angry, and we should be, right? There's a lot of reasons for women to be angry, and it's okay. You find ways to cope that allow anger that presence, that space, and that ability to fuel you. Um, and I'm not saying that in a way to like go out and do harm, because again, there's a difference between anger and violence. And it doesn't always have to lead to violence, but it sure as shit can be the reason that you want to make change. And so I love this piece. I think that it's incredibly powerful. And I think that it's something that's important to talk about. So I hope that all of you have enjoyed this semester. I hope that I will get to see some of you again at maybe some of my other classes. And if I don't, I wish you well on your academic journey, and know that if you need anything, it is always okay to reach out, and I can help you in whatever way that I can. All right. Thank you so much for being part of this class, everybody.